Alive.
Hello, everyone. We're going to give folks a few minutes to log on, get situated, maybe grab some water or coffee or something to snack, while myself and the other incredible Indigenous women on this panel will dive into this topic of Indigenizing philanthropy. So we will start in just a few moments, allowing you all to just get situated and grab what you need, maybe a notepad too. All right, giving folks about one more minute to log on and gather anything that they need as we dive into this discussion. Um, we'll start in about 1 minute. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Daisy Franco, and I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communications here at Cultural Survival. And just before we get started to dive into this incredible conversation with these incredible Indigenous women here on the panel, here at Cultural Survival, we like to open up all of these types of discussions and spaces in a prayerful way. And so that means actually opening up with a prayer. And so with that, I will lead that. And so I invite you all to close your eyes and to take some big deep breaths with me and to really bring your mind into that open, good space. Dear Creator, we thank you so much for bringing all of us here today, both our panelists, all of those who are helping behind the scenes, and of course, all of our audience members here today. Creator, we ask you to bring everyone here into this collective virtual space in a good way so that we can bring all of our minds, our bodies, and our spirits together as one. Creator, we ask you to please watch over all of our communities and our nations, on our workplaces, and every space that we touch. Right now, there is a horrible virus that's going around the world, and we ask you to keep our people and our community and our relatives strong and healthy. Creator, we thank you for all of the blessings that you give us day in and day out that keeps our bodies, our minds, our spirits, and our community strong. Creator, and we ask you to extend those blessings both today and every day, Creator. We thank you so much for everything that you give us, and we thank you so much, Yawa. Oh, and so with that, I want to hand it to my esteemed colleague, Janine Yazzie, who will be our moderator for today. And Janine Yazzie is an incredible Indigenous Dene woman who wears many hats. She is the CEO and co-founder of Six World Solutions, program manager at International Indian Treaty Council, and just so many other things. And I will let her introduce herself as well. And with that, hand it to you, Janine, to get this day started. Thank you so much. Yawanko.
Thank you so much, Daisy, and thank you all for joining us here today. Janine Yazzie and Sinna Janine Shlento Toricini Bashishchin Nahlanet Shado Zilgaida Chanela. I am sharing with you my clans of my people from the Dene Nation. And wanted to introduce myself formally because it's such an honor to moderate such a great panel with some amazing Indigenous sisters and experts in this field. So just a quick overview. This webinar is a culmination of a series of articles and discussions that have been initiated by Cultural Survival. And you can find this series on the news and updates on the Cultural Survival's website. I'm also going to ask our text to post the link into the chat so that you can get an opportunity, if you have not already, to read several of the amazing pieces that were put together by both Galena and Daisy. The first of which was around indigenizing philosophy, and the second around reimagining philanthropy towards relationships, trust, abundance, and radical love. I think I said philosophy because that's really tied into all of this, but it's about indigenizing philanthropy. The third article out of this series is about shifting grant-making practices from extractive to reciprocal relationships. And then the fourth is a really powerful piece on rematriating the distribution of wealth. Now, in philanthropy and in development in particular, there's a lot of discussions right now, especially as we look at recovering from this global pandemic and the ways that it has shifted so much in our societies and our communities. And right now, the role of philanthropy is a really huge sector to focus on and how this plays with recovery. And as people are talking about the shifts and the transitions that are necessary in philanthropy, there's a lot of talk around decolonizing philanthropy and what does that mean? In the article series, a definition or a process is offered through a reference that decolonization is the process of deconstructing colonial ideologies of the superiority and privilege of Western thought and approaches. On one hand, decolonization involves dismantling structures that perpetuate the status quo and addressing unbalanced power dynamics. And our panelists are really going to talk and bring more depth and expertise to this subject and what it looks like to also simultaneously indigenize philanthropy, which our wonderful hosts emphasize in the articles as a simultaneous action that is equally as important. But saying these things and understanding what they mean in context and in application are two different things. And so we really brought these wonderful leaders and the breadth of their expertise, both inside and outside philanthropy, at the local level, at the national level, and at the international and global scale, to bring more of their wisdom and knowledge to help make these concepts much more concrete. One of the beautiful things that quotes that I found in the articles is around what it means to take this tool offered by philanthropy to restore the feminine, to rematriate wealth. And I'm going to read the quote. Some of the most powerful living things in our world are part of the sacred feminine, which plays a central part in the cosmovision of so many Indigenous cultures, and it's expressed through our relations, stories, and ways of life. Many Indigenous worldviews hold that every being carries the qualities of both the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine, and cultivating these energies in a balanced way is our sacred mission. They also instruct us to recognize the convergence in different sacred expressions of these energies, including two-spirit, non-binary, queer, and others. And it ends by saying, shifting to the mindset of abundance, even within the existing system, restores the sacred feminine and rematriates the proposed remedies. And I wanted to really bring and elevate that quote because that's really the work and the labor that is being done when we talk about these necessary shifts and transformations in philanthropy. It is very easy because of a lot of the lack of information about Indigenous peoples, a lack of understanding about our worldviews and what we bring to the these spaces, into these conversations, to politicize our positions under even more Western concepts and Western binaries. But we want to move beyond that and really want to give an opportunity for our wonderful leaders here to share the full breadth and beauty and wisdom behind the work and how they engage in the fields that they carry out. And so the format of the webinar is going to be, I'm going to offer a series of very broad, expansive questions so that can allow our panelists to be at choice with how they elevate and how they respond to and really bring their full breadth of wisdom to the topics. We're inviting our panelists to build off ideas and speak with each other, really trying to cultivate the type of conversation that we would otherwise have if we weren't meeting virtually. And we're going to have, if you have any questions as we're going forward through our program, please submit it through our Q&A or the chat function, whatever you have access to. If you are joining us also via our live stream among the different platforms, you can also put it there. We do have tech support monitoring questions through those medias as well. So please feel free as soon as a question comes up to offer that, and we'll try to incorporate it into our program. If you require translation, please find the translation icon at the bottom of your screen and select your preferred language. I will remind you as we go forward, because we'll have people joining in and joining us at different times. And without further ado, it's my honor to introduce our panelists. We are joined today by Galena Angarava, the Executive Director of Cultural Survival, by Daisy Franco, Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communications at Cultural Survival, Victoria Sweet, Director of Indigenous Communities Grantmaking at the Novo Foundation, Gabby Strong, Managing Director of Indian Foundation at Indian Collective, and Lourdes Inga, Executive Director of International Funders for Indigenous Peoples. And so for this first part, we're really going to talk about setting the stage on understanding philanthropy landscapes from the perspective of the wonderful woman that we have joining us today. And so our first question is, what do you do? Why did you get into this field? And feel free to answer that with the full breadth of what you find appropriate. And we're going to go ahead and start this session with Daisy.
Thank you, Janine. Before I go into that, I actually want to give a shout out to our sponsors first, Justice Funders and International Funders for Indigenous Peoples, who have been our incredible allies in really helping resource this space and this important conversation. And so with that, I'd actually like to introduce myself traditionally. Daisy Janine Yazzie, Anawa Niwagi Delota, Anayade Aga Niwagu Hunjota. Again, my name is Daisy Franco. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communications here at Cultural Survival. And before going into how I got into philanthropy, I'd like to just share a little background about CS. For those who don't know, there are some new faces that I see on our participant list, which I'm really excited, happy you're here. So for those who don't know, CS advocates for Indigenous people's rights and supports Indigenous communities, self-determination, cultures, and political resilience since 1972. And at CS, we have a three-pronged approach, a holistic approach to supporting Indigenous people's rights and self-determination. And that's through Indigenous-led grant-making, advocacy, and capacity building. And so you can go to our website, culturalsurvival.org, for more information on our programs. But a little about me. So I was born and raised on the United Reservation, grew up really as a direct service provider and organizer working in the fields of corrections, mental health, and education. And after some time in those fields, I had then stepped into philanthropy, where I was a program officer and fellow at the Christensen Fund, managing their local and only domestic work with the Bay Area program. And so I believe that all of my work as someone who worked on the ground directly with communities, both being raised in community and having my career really being based off that has allowed me to understand the fullness and all of the insides and outs of philanthropy and how philanthropy impacts community and vice versa. And so I won't dive too much more into that because I know a lot of folks know me here, but actually want to give space for our other panelists to really talk about themselves. Thank you, Janine.
Next, can we hear from Gabby?
Hamidak Yapi, greetings, friends and relatives, and thank you to Janine for facilitating this conversation with us today. My name is Gabby Strong. I'm Sistin Waptin Brewankantu Dakota, and I'm zooming in from our Dakota homelands in Minnesota. I'm currently serving as the managing director of the Indian Foundation with Indian Collective and nearing a year in that role. And the growth trajectory of this effort over just 2.5 years has been nothing short of amazing and incredible in terms of the Indigenous-led grant making that we've been able to do in this short period of time. As far as how I entered into this field, I guess I first want to make a couple of distinctions that first, Indigenous people have had philanthropic, reciprocal practices and traditions since time immemorial. And I think what we're trying to discuss today is institutional philanthropy, which looks very different and behaves very differently. So I think that's the conversation that we're entering into today. And I think the way in which I first entered this early in my early years was being asked to be an advisor or sitting on advisory boards or advisory panels, advisory committees. And advisor being the operative word here, because I think decades later, not much has shifted beyond being advisors to institutional philanthropy, because rarely do you see Indigenous people in decision-making roles on boards of directors or trustees or in senior leadership positions. There still remains very few, even on staff, of institutional philanthropic organizations. So I entered into the field in that way as advisors, and then later taking on formal program officer roles, first with the Grotto Foundation in Indigenous language revitalization at the time. And this is going back to like the year 2000. So dating myself a little bit here, but I'll just share that much. And good to be here and part of this discussion today. Thank you, Pidamaya.
Excellent, great points. Next we have Victoria.
Miigwech, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm so honored to get to be a part of this conversation. I'm in a slightly different experience than many of our other panelists, and I'm excited to share a little bit about it in that perspective. First, I'm calling in from Lenape territories in what is now the Hudson Valley of New York. And I am working at the Novo Foundation. The Novo Foundation is a large private foundation. It is not an Indigenous-led foundation, but it has had a commitment to serving Indigenous communities since its inception. I sort of stumbled somehow almost accidentally into philanthropy, never saw myself in this world. I started in the world of education. My master's is in education. I was studying Indigenous forms of education. Then I went to law school. I got a certificate in Indigenous law and policy, was really working on the ground, doing a lot of nonprofit type work. So a lot of my experience was actually as someone who was trying to get funds. And when someone sent me this opportunity to apply for an opportunity to work in philanthropy, I thought a lot about the challenges that face Indigenous communities. The challenge to get access, to even know what foundations are out there, what streams of funding are possible, and how you navigate a world that is so, is structured so differently from how you maybe view the world or how you view resources, the language you have to know how to speak, the processes you have to go through. Like Gabby, I always view giving as very Indigenous. I can't think of an Indigenous community that doesn't have some kind of giveaways or gifting or an idea, a traditional value that we share resources and we take care of each other. But then philanthropy, as it is as a body, is a completely different thing. And so the opportunity to be in a place and to learn myself, to be able to share what I'm learning, and to see if there's a way to open access, to get that information out to our communities and start to remove the barriers that systems have made for our Indigenous communities, because resources really does hold back a lot of what we desperately want to do for ourselves. How do we make a change there? How do we open up those channels and provide more opportunities? And so I've been really, I feel very lucky that I've had this opportunity to be in this place, to serve in a role where I'm not only managing existing grants, but really working directly with others within our foundation and in other foundations to discuss what the future could look like and how to make philanthropy more in alignment for our communities. So thank you.
Excellent. Next we'll hear from Lourdes.
Thank you, Janine. Hello, everyone. I first want to thank Galena and Daisy for inviting me to join this conversation alongside with Victoria and Gabby. I look forward to learning from all of you and to listen to your experience and the wisdom that you'll be sharing throughout that time together. I think to answer that question, I want to start by first acknowledging that it also comes from an experience of being an immigrant to this country. And the role that mentors have had throughout my life, both either because of school and at academia, but also a couple of Indigenous women who have walked with me on a personal journey of reclaiming my ancestral roots. And so I want to just, again, thank you for the invitation. My name is Lourdes Zinga, and Executive Director of International Funders for Indigenous Peoples. And I have to say, I've been drawn to social justice for a long time. And I think that's one of the ways I found myself entering philanthropy, first through the experience of working at the Global Fund for Women at a very, very sort of young age in my career. And for those of you that don't know the Global Fund for Women, there are women's rights public foundations who focus on supporting grassroots women's organizations globally. And I think that from there, what I saw and learned from there is just the power of both the energy that forms when women are actually making decisions and processes that impact women, and also the activism that comes with that as well. And from there on, I was really able to see the power comes when one brings their passion for moving resources to shift narratives, to shift power dynamics, and to respect and support the rights, in the case of the Global Fund for Women, the rights of women, and then later on entering another foundation who very much represented many of the values that I've seen at a place like the Global Fund, the Christensen Fund, which focus on the rights of Indigenous peoples. From there on, I've been focused on this world of nonprofit and philanthropy, and found myself 3 years ago becoming the executive director of IFIP. And since then, we've been really thinking about how do we shift. I mean, I think that the points that Gabby raised are points that I echo. I think as a sector, those of us that are working in this field, we need to do more to change the status quo so that foundations continue to reflect and question themselves as to why is it that they're not resourcing Indigenous peoples in the same way as other communities, or why is it that there's no Indigenous staff on their foundations or in their leadership. So it is clear, I'm glad we're having this conversation, and it's clear from not only spaces like the one Cultural Survival is creating today, but other spaces that there's an incredible leadership and wisdom, including in this panel, to really push and start really doing the transformative work that we want to see happening, that we it has not come up all of a sudden. It has been brought up many times over. I think what's different now is you have this amazing group of people, not just on this panel, but in other spaces that are doing the work and the really hard work to transform philanthropy.
Thank you, Lourdes. And last, Galena.
Thank you. Semba na hudutun hudud. My name is Galena Angarava. I am an Indigenous Buryat. It's an largest Indigenous group in Siberia. I'm also the executive director of Cultural Survival. I was born into the Abzai clan of the Ihirit people, of the Buryat peoples in Siberia, and my people have lived for millennia on both sides of the largest freshwater lake in the world, called Lake Baikal. And since the time of memorial, we have been hunting and fishing, bartering fish and meat, gathering food, and celebrating each other. And we've done it since the time immemorial. So I grew with my grandmother in our village. Her name was Yekaterina. Her traditional name was Dulma, and I think about her a lot. She was the one who, through traditional stories, have built the foundation of my values and principles and built who I am today. And I want to share some of my stories from my village because it will lead to understanding what philanthropy means for me. I remember that more than 90% of our food came from our forest and from some fields that we cultivated with potato, beets, and carrots. And only on rare occasions we had to buy salt and sugar and a little bit of wheat flour. But most of the food came from our land. I recall that my grandmother, when she had an excess of milk, sour cream, of cottage cheese, she would always share it out to other families. And in return, other grandmothers in our community would share with meat, would share with the harvest of wild strawberries or wild blueberries with us. At any given time, every family was taken care of and no one went hungry. No one was left behind. And that was my first experience of philanthropy in my own community. In my village, the houses were scattered. So my grandmother's village was close to the river. And the furthest house from my grandmother's house, it was about 1.5 miles, 2 miles away. So all the houses were scattered. And I grew up with all of my cousins, 15, 20 of us, running around, playing in the dirt, running through the forest, playing hide and seek, playing in the river nearby my grandmother's house. And we knew that during the day, whenever we would end up, we were taken care of, that every grandmother in the village was keeping an eye on us, was making sure that we were safe when Lunchtime came up. A grandmother where we played, close to the house where we played, she would herd us into her house and feed us. And we were feeling safe and secure and fed at any moment of the day. So that's what philanthropy was for me growing up. And that's what I think that we as Indigenous peoples bring to the table, to the understanding what philanthropy should be. So the word philanthropy does not exist in my native language. It does not exist in many Indigenous languages, but what exists is the concept of it. Our traditional practices, our belief systems, our values and principles, our original instructions from our ancestors, our cosmovisions. And at Cultural Survival, we have our Keepers of the Earth Fund. And I think that we managed to bring those original instructions and values and principles as a foundation of our fund. And I think that's what is going to set up as a North Star, as a guiding star for us, for our staff, or for our partners in the field, other foundations. And that's what we're bringing to the table. Thank you.
Wow. If we were in a room, I know you would all be receiving like a round of applause. Like already you have set the tone and really brought a different type of magic to this conversation that is always lacking in these spaces when we're talking about philanthropy and the role and it plays in our communities. In a way, I think you also answered my next question. So if we do have the answers short, we can add another one that came in through our Q&A function. But the next question is, why is it important to increase the number of Indigenous women in positions of decision-making power in philanthropy? What is it that Indigenous women bring to the table that can help transform the field? And what are the challenges in elevating and sustaining their leadership? That sustaining is an important one. And so for this one, we will start with Victoria.
Thank you. I had written down some notes, but after hearing Galena speaking so beautifully about the grandmothers in her community, I think that illustrates exactly why you need a women's perspective. Every person must have somewhere a grandmother, an auntie, a mother, someone that when they think of them, they remember pertinent life lessons, that it impacts like their core and their direction. And I think that there's something very special there about the things that women bring into a community and into a family, and also into organizations. I don't know why in the Western world, why we seem to think that a woman has to approach the world like a man in order to succeed in the world. That's not the case. We bring our own special and unique perspectives, the way that we see the world. I have a great grandmother that I never met, but I have heard stories about her living on our reservation. The times were really tough. She was alone with her children, kids being taken away to boarding school, and she would grow these big gardens. And there was a man in town, and he had a drinking problem, and he would come and he would steal food out of the garden. And people would get upset and they would say, you know, this man is stealing. You're a woman and you're alone with your children. He's stealing from you and you should go do something. And her comment would be, if he's taking it from me, he must really need it. And many times it's caused me to step back and ask myself some questions about my approach to things. And do I really need to approach things in a way that maybe the dominant culture suggests? And what can I learn from that great grandmother? I also think that as Indigenous communities, we've had a layer of colonialism put on top of us. And in that layer, our women who were not traditionally lower than the man or not in power got pushed down into those positions because the colonists came in and they influenced and they installed certain things, and it impacted our communities. If you really want to understand the core of what is impacting a community, you've got to go to the ones who are the most deeply impacted. And in most cases, that's our women. You want to hear the real core of the things that we're working through, come talk to our women. And if you really want to also hear the beautiful ideas about how to move forward and how to heal, I also believe that our women have unique perspectives. So I think that those are just some of the things I am sitting with. And I do think it is hard to sustain. There's a lot of pressures on us, but I think it's a beautiful thing when our women are in these positions and can share these perspectives.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Lourdes?
Yeah, I would just put a shout out. If you have not read Cultural Survival's article on Repatriating Philanthropy, make sure to take a moment to read it after this webinar. I would say that, you know, a lot, I think, of what I'm going to share throughout this webinar comes from that place of just experience of institutional philanthropy and what I've sort of seen and not seen happening throughout sort of my experience in this sector. I would say Indigenous women bring not only their own experiences, the experience and the feeling that comes with those experiences, but also the responsibility of the well-being of their communities. I think the understanding of the interconnectedness of the issues, which is key if you think about it, both in roles and foundation roles when you're thinking about in programmatic ways, and which is, I think, one of the many reasons we see in foundations working constantly on silos. I also think that the power of Indigenous women to heal, it's incredible, the sisterhood, the solidarity. And I personally have been on the receiving end of that, because I want to acknowledge the role of a couple of Indigenous women that have had, particularly on my own personal journey, to break away from colonial impositions on who is and who's not an Indigenous person. And in my case, speaking from an experience of being from Peru. So I think, you know, it is true, we don't see a lot of Indigenous leadership in philanthropy, much less Indigenous women leading in philanthropy. I am glad to see that we have Victoria here, we have Gabi, Galena, and Daisy, and Janine, who plays a role in a variety of ways. But I also do to see that others that are entering in a leadership role into foundation roles. I also think that funding Indigenous women it's something that foundations, and I think I can openly also say that even within the women's rights movement has been missed and needs to be happening more of. To really think about how do you decolonize philanthropy, how do you decolonize movements, is to include the voices and the leadership of Indigenous women across all these spaces. So I'll leave it like that. I'm eager to hear from others because I'm just enjoying, I'm not following my notes. And I think it's probably best to just speak from the heart and what your body's telling you to share.
Thank you, Lourdes. I know I find myself tearing up and getting really emotional just hearing the beauty you guys are sharing. So I'm also not following my notes. Next, we'll have Galena.
Thank you so much. I just want to reflect on Indigenous women leadership too, by saying that in my culture, they say that if you bring 100 women together in ceremony and prayer, that nothing can stop us from manifesting things into reality. And I just carry that so deep in my heart. I know that. But I also know that we need to get there. We have how many women right now on this call and joining us? Probably over 100, right? But we all need to be on the same level of understanding the issue and support each other and extend that support to each other. I think Indigenous women and women, just such powerful beings that we create. We have this regenerative functions, caring functions, a spiritual purpose for our families and communities. We create life. We are a direct manifestation of the mother of all mothers, which is land, you know. So the sacred land, the trees, the mother bear, they all have this uniting feature, being able to procreate and give life to other beings. And that's what we are. And we're very powerful. And I think that philanthropy needs to recognize that too. My grandmother, again, I think about her a lot. So she would wake up in the morning and she would know the weather for the day, right? She would know what the harvest of wild strawberry, and it's a really staple food for my people, what the harvest of wild strawberry in the fall would be like months before the harvest itself. She would know that in the spring. She would raise up her hand and feel the wind and play with it. That's what I do today too, these days. She play and she would know what's coming. I don't know, it's just this connection to the land, that special connection to the land, being able to interpret the language of the land and communicate among ourselves what's happening, what the weather is going to be like, what the harvest is going to be like. That's what Indigenous women bring. And I think that knowledge is absolutely sacred and it can be quantified in dollar amounts and we all need to get back to that. That's what Indigenous women are strong with and can bring to the field. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Galena. Gabby?
Yeah, this is, it's really complex because I think the power and the truth that Indigenous women bring to any role, and in this case to institutional philanthropy, brings insight, wisdom, ways in which to work most effectively and strategically on many fronts. So that essentially, that's why it's important. But there's a broader issue here. And that is that institutional philanthropy remains a bastion of white supremacy, meaning that the structure and the decision-making is based on white, male, Euro-American centric sensibilities, ideals, and thoughts about where resources should be directed, how they should be directed, to whom they should be directed. And so whether it's Indigenous women, Indigenous people, helping to dismantle that system and the way in which it is structured and the way in which it carries out its work. Dismantling white supremacy is important to do. We are in justice mode. We are in movement mode. And I think in many ways, institutional philanthropy is still struggling and grappling with whether or not diversity is important, inclusion is important, equity is important, justice is important to their work. And I think in the broader world and communities in which we live, I think there's a loud yes to that. All of that is important, and all of that needs to be integrated and part of dismantling the way in which philanthropy, institutional philanthropy, behaves and conducts business today. And I'm going to mention the Gospel of Wealth that was written by Andrew Carnegie. You know, going back decades, when he was one of the richest men in the world in his time. But I bring this up because, you know, within that writing, within that piece, he refers to the Sioux, which is my people, and how they were referred to. We call ourselves Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, also known as the Great Sioux Nation. That is how we're identified in treaties. But we are a part of the larger Ocheti Shankowi, the 7 council fires that spans across the upper Midwest into our sacred Black Hills, all the way through Minnesota and beyond. A large nation of people. Andrew Carnegie encountered us at one point, and he wrote about how impressed he was and awestruck he was by the way in which our communities took care of one another, how the leaders were no more richer, quote unquote, than the others around them. But despite being impressed by that, he still firmly believed, and in his Gospel of Wealth, he writes about how essentially rich people need to make decisions about how resources are used and to whom it should be directed. That is the root of institutional philanthropy today. That is what needs to be uprooted. That is part of the dismantling that needs to happen today. So if Indigenous women are coming into those settings, they bring with them knowledge and skill and expertise and a worldview and a life experience that is beneficial, not just to Indigenous people, but to all people, to all systems. There's ways in which we can decentralize leadership instead of hierarchical structures that are archaic and worn out. Those are just some of the ways in which Indigenous women can benefit this field of philanthropy. So I'll share that much for now.
Oh my gosh. Oh, all right. Daisy, take us home with this question.
Yeah, I think I'm also just really taking in everyone's responses and also thinking through what are my responses to everyone's sharing. But with that, I also just want to outline that the fact that we're asking this question in itself is a reflection of the imbalance that exists in our world today. The imbalance between the masculine and the sacred energy. And I'm not talking about genders, I'm talking about energies, right? And so when I speak to the sacred feminine, that's inclusive of non-binary, two-spirit, queer, and other relatives, right? And that colonization has really forced us and conditioned us to think that the masculine energy, and mostly in the white form, white men, are the only ones capable of making these decisions, the only ones capable of making sure that our communities and our economies are taken care of. And that's just not true. And it's evident with the stories, the personal stories that you're hearing today. And especially in Indigenous cultures. And I want to offer this excerpt from the article that we just produced last week on rematriating the distribution of wealth, where we, Galena and I, share our worldview on what rematriation looks like, and how that can apply to philanthropy. And so for us, rematriation is a process of going back to balanced relationships, to understanding and living our original instructions of protecting and honoring the sacred feminine, of honoring our grandmothers, our mothers, and our daughters, and trusting that they will make the best decisions to benefit our families, our communities, Mother Earth, and all human and non-human relatives for the generations to come. And whereas compared to repatriation, it's individualistic and gendered, implying that only the masculine energy is in control of returning and receiving. And rematriation is the act of returning, or rather aligning with the collective under the stewardship and leadership of women. And so shifting towards rematriation actually better reflects the natural laws of reciprocity and equity in our world. And given that sacred feminine is what nourishes all living things. And so with that, there is a huge gap in philanthropy, right? Where Indigenous women aren't. Of course, here you see a dozen of Indigenous women here, both as panelists and even in the comments, right, who are contributing to the field and recognizing that each one of us wear a different hat and are contributing to the field of institutional philanthropy, right? But in the context of what rematriation or uplifting Indigenous women's leadership and philanthropy, for me, it really means to center and to develop and sustain Indigenous women's leadership. And of course, extending that to our Two-Spirit, our Femi, and our non-binary relatives as other leaders as well that need to be centered in this field. And that philanthropy, as it already has, needs to continue to embrace the leadership of our women and really seek to elevate our leadership in our board, in the staff, in grantee partner organizations. So like Gabby had mentioned in her introductions, right, as really entering this field as an advisor, we can't just look at it as Indigenous women and the contributions they bring to this field as advisors, right? And someone pointed out in the comments, advisors do not make decisions in the same way that an executive director does, as the same way that a board president does. And so we need to really think about the ways that we can continue to elevate Indigenous women's leadership in this field. But even in doing that, right, in the key term of this question, sustaining Indigenous women's leadership, that we need to get, when we do bring women into this field, we need to give them the space to really speak without fear, to speak without intimidation, to speak without intimidation, and to seek out their expert opinions and perspectives by also supporting them with adequate self-determined resources and connections so they can succeed in the field. It's one thing to just, say, we got an Indigenous women staff member and that's it. You have to continually support them and they need to self-determine what that support is. And so I have a lot of other thoughts on this, but with that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Janine, to take us into the next question. Thank you.
Excellent. So we have our agenda, but what I'm seeing in the responses that I'm getting from the chat and the Q&A to everything you guys are saying, like there's a lot of movement happening that I want to honor. So I'm going to go ahead and give you some of the follow-up questions that we received from the Q&A. I'm going to direct each question to a specific speaker, so that way we'll be able to condense this in time. And so for the first question, I wanted to give this to Lourdes. How big is Native philanthropy and when did it start and to what fields does it apply mainly? And this was asked by Dominique Godrich.
Yeah, I think I'm going to break it in a couple of ways. One, I think focusing on sort of native philanthropy in the sense of funding Native communities here in the U.S. Because of the great work of Native Americans in philanthropy, who I think 2 years ago now did a lot of work to do that research and provide that information to the field. We know, and we're benefiting from their work because we know that less than 0.5%, in fact, I think is 0.4% of foundation giving, that is giving from US foundations to Native Americans organizations or Native communities, it's less, it's not even a half of a percentage. And so that can tell you how big that is. And it's, I don't know, have any other word but to say it. It's painful to see that. I think it's not right for all the conversations that foundations sort of organize around in terms of justice, in terms of social justice, in terms of racial equity. The data shows you that conversations, organizing dialogues, training your staff on how you are turn your organization into sort of a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization, it's not enough. You really need to really think about why is it that foundations have had this huge blind spot, and it's not doing a lot about it, right? And when it comes to international funding to Indigenous peoples, we know that the data is somewhat similar. IFF has been thinking about really how do we really invest on doing something like what NAP has done, Native Americans in Philanthropy has done, to provide for the field clarity on data as to what, how much funding is going to Indigenous peoples worldwide. We know from a couple of resources that from a period of over 4 years, between 2011 and 2015, we know that funders who are doing funding internationally, that a total of that funding, only 1.2% over 4 years went to support Indigenous peoples globally. I think what's important to distinguish, though, on any of these sort of data sets that we look at or that philanthropy organizations put out, is to really understand who's actually benefiting from those from that giving. Because while we can sort of see from this information that funding is going to Indigenous peoples, when you actually start digging a little more, you really then to start understanding that within sort of the 1.2% that I referred to about globally, only a certain percentage went to actual Indigenous-led organizations. So I think there's need to be more. And that's one of the things that IFF wants to just make sure it's investing on over the next year to put out some more of those trends, because it is important for the advocacy role that we're trying to also do more around not only being as allies or as sort of educators or providing the space to collaborate among our members, but really as advocates in philanthropy to really shift and transform what has been the status quo for too long. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Lourdes, could you put a link to IFIP or your contact information in case people want to follow up with that? And then I'm only going to take one more question, and this one's going to be to Gabby from Natalie Dixon. As a Native youth, it's been awesome to see Indigenous youth take an active stand for issues facing Indigenous peoples. She gives examples of the occupation of the legislature in Victoria, Kumeyaay Defense Against the Wall, and other grassroots organized mutual aid funds. She asks, as a young Native woman, how should the roles and considerations in institutional philanthropy indigenize to include people like me? And how can we direct that philanthropy to foster those movements that are on the ground?
First, I would say, keep telling your truth, keep speaking your truth. I think we've all been tireless advocates in this field that has remained largely unchanged and status quo. The stats that Lourdes just spoke to in terms of the level of giving to Indigenous-led causes or Indigenous-led organizations has remained largely unchanged for decades, despite all of the studies, despite all of the reports, despite all of the tireless advocacy that takes place from Native Americans in Philanthropy and Candid and others. So when I say we're in justice mode, we really are in justice mode. To me, you know, rematriation of an indigenizing philanthropy means full rematriation of wealth, full transfer into Indigenous hands and Indigenous control. And anything short of that falls on a spectrum of systemic change. And so to a young person, a young woman, I would challenge philanthropy to accept and bring you on where you are. I think, you know, before the pandemic, this pandemic forced us to be able to work together in different ways. Look at us now. We're all working virtually and remotely. Most foundations are headquartered in large urban areas. So therefore they hire or want people to move to large urban areas in order to be staffed. And I think that needs to change, and that can change now. We should be expecting them to bring people in from tribal communities, from rural areas, from more remote areas, all across Indian country, all across Turtle Island, because we have the capability to do that. And we're doing it now. So that's just one of the ways. And then I would say that always have your peer support network, because that's what's going to keep you fortified in this field, being fortified in this field. But continue to speak your truth. I think we all continue to speak our truth and look for ways that this system is dismantled and restructured in a different way that truly reflects Indigenous people, Indigenous women.
Excellent. So now for the second half of our program, we're going to be diving deeper into the importance of shifting philanthropy and supporting rights-based approaches. So we'll be building off a lot of the language that has been introduced and a lot of the real rich concepts that our panelists have brought up in their answers. And so this next question is about hearing a lot about decolonizing philanthropy, which can be identified as focusing on unwiring colonial, extractive, and exploitative attributes that interfere with equity, justice, and balance in relationships in our environments. And in the article series, Daisy and Galena emphasized the importance of simultaneously indigenizing philanthropy and brought up a lot of that those rich concepts as well about how indigenizing replaces or rather returns us to original ways of being and knowing, which supports reciprocal relationships between peoples and place. And I think all of you so beautifully tied that into what you were sharing about your expertise and your experiences. And so we want to focus particularly on the concept of the rematriation of wealth as a shift that better reflects the natural laws of reciprocity and equality, and that is inherent in so many Indigenous peoples' cosmovisions. How do we continue this path to decolonize, indigenize, and or transform philanthropy? And we will start with Galena.
Thank you, Janine. Thank you for the intro. And I just wanted to kind of add to that decolonizing is one part of the process that requires unwiring old structures, shedding what doesn't serve us anymore. And the other part requires indigenizing, requires us returning back to our original ways of being and knowing. And that's actually reflected on our neuropaths in the brain. It will require patience and time to transition from one paradigm to the other, but it's actually physically reflected in your neuropaths. So where do we start as people, as professionals in philanthropy? I think it starts with a gentle inquiry to ourselves, to our soul and heart and mind, with questions. What values do I bring to my work, to our partner organizations? How do I connect with these people around me? How do I show up in the spaces, in the meetings with potential partners and grantees? What are the nonverbal cues am I communicating? And remember that 80% of our communications is actually communicated through our body language. That's important. How do I minimize, as a program officer or executive director of a fund or foundation, how do I minimize that power imbalance with potential partners and grantees, or with the existing partners and grantees? What conditioning and structures I carry that prevent me from understanding the situation of the culture, the situation, and the struggles of the people that I would like to support? Am I communicating abundance? Am I communicating scarcity? I think that starting with that gentle inquiry to your own self is very important. And if you remember my story about my grandmother, about sharing the excess of food to the families, there is a continuation to that story, which I would like to share. With my grandmother, with my mother's generation, moving out of the community in pursuit of careers, education, my mother was the first one in our community to get her high degree in the city. So with that came the inflow of money into the community, the physical money. And that's where we noticed a shift. We noticed the relationship shift. We noticed that people started withholding their food. We also experienced the rise in alcoholism in my community. And that's when the story of abundance, because you give away out of the state of abundance, right, started being replaced with the story of scarcity, unfortunately. We experienced, in my lifetime, I experienced the shift from gift economy to money economy, which led me to think, what is it about the money that informed that shift? And I came to a conclusion that the concept of scarcity is actually inherent to money. And my question to all of you, to the panelists, is that how do we apply the practice and the concept of abundance to the existing monetary system, to the existing status quo? How we can adapt and innovate together? How we move beyond just giving grants to giving the actual gifts, and going back to the gift, to the notion of gift economy? And I think it's possible. We have incredible movers and shakers in the field of philanthropy. I've met many of them. And some of them already made that possible, some of the shifts possible, by building authentic relationships with people, building trust with people through perpetual learning, by opening their hearts and minds to the people on the grassroots level, to the indigenous peoples, by supporting organizations with unrestricted funds, by supporting organizations with multi-year funds, by thinking outside the box, by supporting holistic approaches, not just siloed. I'm funding education and I'm not funding food sovereignty. I'm funding health, but I'm not funding indigenous women. No, by funding holistic approaches. And money is just one expression of energy. There are other ways to express your energy. by solidarity, by support, by heartfelt advice, by connecting people, by making introductions to another funder, by sharing and exchanging resources, by participating in strategy. Yes, you can, as a funder, be supportive by participating in strategy and co-creating with your partners, and by celebrating together. That too, that's very important. So I think that we can change the course of history, we can change the status quo. And as I was a board member for International Funders for Indigenous Peoples for 7 years. And it was a privilege and my joy to be serving the organization in that capacity. And I met and learned from many movers and shakers in the field, from many peers that operate from the mindset of abundance, who have been able to incorporate Indigenous values and principles in their work, in their respective institutions. But there's so much work that still needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Galena. We're going to go to Gabby now.
Thank you, Janine. You know, it makes me think about, you know, the values that we each live by. And for me as a Dakota woman, there are several values of Wo'unshira, which is compassion, and values of Wo'ohitika, which is courage. And I think those two values have helped me the most in these roles, because for those that have read Edgar Villanueva's book, Decolonizing Wealth, where, you know, a lot of this conversation, you know, has continued from the release of that book a couple of years ago. He talks about working within the belly of the beast for those of us that have worked in institutional philanthropy. And it really is that at times, working within the belly of the beast, but still being able to do good work, still being able to support communities, and still being able to shape and shift the way in which philanthropy behaves. For as long as Indigenous women and Indigenous people continue to speak their truth, the change in which Galena is referring to will occur, but it has been a slow process. So when I speak about being in justice mode right now, for me, time's up. We need to do this now, because what it's been my experience that institutional philanthropy uses its power and its privilege to set its own priorities at its own pace, on its own time. And that needs to change. Because at the end of the day, they too are accountable to community. They too are nonprofit organizations accountable to community, the same as we are accountable to our communities first and foremost. I chose to join NDN Collective because I was drawn to the mission and the vision of the organization, where a mindset of abundance was the foundation upon which this vision and this mission was based. And to be so very intentional about supporting grassroots efforts, community-based solutions, community self-determination, which is very complex and sometimes doesn't fit and align within institutional philanthropy's ideas of best practices or models for replication and scale, which we have to be very careful about, because if we are truly supporting community self-determination, that looks very different and distinct community to community. So be careful about replication and scale, right? What I would say about NDN and this new way of thinking is that we don't define ourselves as an intermediary, because an intermediary may imply that we're advancing strategies from the outside and planting them into community, and that's not what we're about. We're about supporting community-based solutions and community-based strategies as the community defines them. Unrestricted, multi-year, large grants, general operating, all of the above. Because we're talking about generational work here, generational change. So being really tunnel visioned on like project and programs is not generational work. And our communities need generational work. So I'll pause there.
Yes, very strong point, Gabby. Victoria?
This is recorded, right? So I can go back and actually take notes on what you guys are saying, because so many powerful points. And I think what I've been sitting with is going to be sort of saying some of it again, but I think it's worth restating, which is communities are their own experts on what they need to heal. And when you come in from the outside and you say, well, we're only going to fund this, or we're only going to fund that, and you put a community in a place where they have to adapt to the funders' request, the funders' priorities, and they're not actually listening to what the community itself needs, you can actually do harm. You can slow things down. The community knows. They know their answers. And even Indigenous community to another community, I can't go in and speak for some other community. I can't even speak for my own right. I'm not even living on my home reservation right now. So that's not the place. To have the ability to stop and listen, we're not asking funders to save us. We can save ourselves. We simply need the blocks to be moved out of our way so that we're able to get access to the things that give us a little space to do what it is that we need to do. So I don't think that can be stated strongly enough or often enough. I also think that I remember working in nonprofits, and it seemed like they only ever wanted to fund Indigenous issues if all we did was talk about our pain. And it's important to educate people and to have them know the history, because so much of it isn't taught. But there's also room for people who are like, you know what, here's what I actually want to talk to you about. Look at the beauty, look at our vision, look at all of the amazing things that we know and that we have to offer the world. And making space for that also, because again, if you're talking about this perspective of people from the outside who think they need to come save Indigenous communities, they also just want to live in those, in all of the dark and the sad and the poor communities. We're incredible, rich, diverse, beautiful communities, and we deserve to show up like that. There is nothing more empowering than to be recognized for your beauty, not just for your pain. And how many people allow the space for us to show up in that way? And I think it's important for funders coming from the outside to put a pause and to realize you don't have all the answers for what is needed. It's time to listen, to build that relationship, to ask those self-reflective questions, and to be open to someone showing maybe another way that Indigenous communities can look than what your perspectives, your stereotypes, or your ideas may be.
Thank you for those important points, Victoria. Lourdes?
Yeah, maybe I want to just bring in my IFEP spin to this. I think how I'm looking at all of this now is really to also look within our members. Earlier, Galena spoke about many of those different funders who are doing the work to sort of unlearn and learn of new ways of approaching, building relationship with Indigenous peoples. I appreciate Gavi's point on the point on intermediary, on how they're not, and I think rightly so. I totally, Gavi, I am with you on that sort of, again, a definition, because it comes from a structure that it sort of comes from a mindset that they're at a different level in how that sort of power dynamic happens between endowed funders versus non-endowed funders. But I think, like all of you, I'm thinking that how do we continue to grow this? How do we continue to amplify, to see this circle grow? And I've been thinking about, we do need funders that are doing that important work to really kind of break away from what's been a status quo for so long. But we also need them to really challenge their peers as well, right? To really bring them into the circle, have them meet with like the NDN Collective, with Cultural Survival, and with all the other Indigenous-led funds that are now taking the leadership and really bringing a new vision for how philanthropy can be. And it's coming from a place that it's based on community needs, that breaks away from separating the needs of community because it fits, or we are trying to fit it into the strategy. And often foundation strategies are built, yes, from program staff, but we also know that foundations invest so much money on hiring consultants that sometimes are so far away from the realities of the communities. So, the other piece I also want to bring to this is, we know and we've seen from data trends that there are foundations that have been investing in Indigenous peoples, and we, yes, we acknowledge that, but I'm also questioning, what is then their role to become non-essential, right? How are they recognizing, is there something there that is not working if they continue to be the main funder either of a whole region or a main funder of Indigenous peoples world at the global scale? There's something definitely wrong if the funder is not really questioning, why is it that they continue to be in that same position? What they have missed, and why are they not pushing other foundations to do more? So I think, yes, funders need to do more to understand and how their practices are supporting or not supporting the communities that they want us that they are working with. But they also need to be more, to be better advocates, and to really kind of think about, at what point are we serving the purpose, particularly if you continue to be the main funder of a whole region, or if Indigenous peoples in a whole region. And that to me worries me, that there are not opportunities. And I would like to maybe add one more thing. IFIP is a member organization. We're inviting and opening conversations with many new funders which are wanting to learn. But there's also been times when I gone to have conversations, and the answer that I've received is that they can't partner with IFEP because they don't have a program for Indigenous peoples. And I think, like Gabby, I'm coming to a place where that is not okay to have an answer like that, to in some ways really not even think of, really understand what their answer means, to say we don't fund Indigenous peoples because we don't have an Indigenous program. There's something terribly wrong with that answer. And I think going forward, IFA wants to do more to really kind of push that, question that what you mean by that, why are you not funding them, and why do you have to have an Indigenous peoples program to actually fund Indigenous peoples when they should be funding in education, in health, in women's rights across all these different areas, and not just because they have an Indigenous peoples program. So yeah, so there's still many ways in which IFEP also needs to take ownership of that responsibility to continue to amplify the work of everyone is doing, everyone that is in this panel and others that are not part of this panel, but also do it in a way that it's also speaking truth, and being polite and being complicit only goes so far. And I think it is really time to really be direct, to be nudging in a way that it's really getting to the ears of the leadership. We know that that's where the shift needs to be made. We know that we have amazing program allies and a program program directors, program officers, but we really need the leadership of foundations to understand what is it that they're not, why is it that they're not funding Indigenous peoples at the scale that they should be funding them.
Excellent. Thank you, Lourdes. Daisy.
Thank you, everyone, for everything that you shared. And I agree. I feel like I need to go back and make some notes of all of this incredible conversation. So I think the question was, how do we decolonize, indigenize, and/or transform philanthropy? I think what needs to be understood first and foremost, and Galena had mentioned this, is that decolonizing, at least in my opinion, decolonizing and indigenizing a system, they're not synonymous, right? They're both important and complementary processes. I understand colonization as focusing on the unwiring, colonial, extractive, and exploitative attributes that interfere with equity, justice, and balance in relationships and our environment. And indigenizing replaces, or rather returns us to our original ways of being and knowing, which really supports reciprocity and reciprocal relationships between people and place. And so that really needs to be understood in terms of the approach to this work, of whether it's to decolonize, indigenize, and/or transform. And I think adding on to what Galena had mentioned earlier of doing that gentle inquiry, we need to recognize that colonialism is embedded in philanthropy in more ways that we want to admit. And so we really need to identify currently in our systems where colonization shows up, right? In the field, in our organizations, in our practices, in our relationships. And I think philanthropy really needs to normalize introspective and honest conversations about these colonial roots, about colonial practices that still exist today, extractive practices that exist in their grant making, right? And to really boldly acknowledge and denounce the harm that foundations and institutional philanthropy has done to our communities in Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And, you know, these actions, they're not it's not like a one-time task or just like a checkbox, but it's an ongoing act of recognition and admission. And I think that has, as it is as an ongoing practice, actually builds better practices and eventually shifts organizational culture, practices, and outcomes. And I feel some feedback that I have gotten from some white colleagues in the field has been, we know what we've done. We know the issues that exist. We know the harm that has happened. And a lot of folks really want to move beyond that. And so do I. But we also, if we want to move forward, we also need to remember where we came from and to keep that as a center part of the conversation on top of other things so that we don't revert back to those ways, right? And I think for me to indigenize philanthropy, I see it as really realigning with those traditional values of Indigenous peoples, and that if those values become a priority for a foundation, that they're overseen and managed, really, that implementation of such by Indigenous peoples who are the experts of what those values mean in practice in all of its forms. And so as you'll see in our article, which I hope everyone read, if not, please read. We'll put some links again in the chat. Some of the ideas that Galena and I have shared in the article of how to indigenize philanthropy is really through transformative leadership. And so that includes, centering and uplifting Indigenous women in leadership positions, having balanced decision-making practices, having it be reflective of the communities that you serve, having learning be a perpetual objective for the institution and actually a budgetary line item for foundations. And some other things is actually moving towards, again, reciprocity and having that be reflected in your relationships that you build with partners and that you build with communities. And lastly, really, again, embracing the practice of abundance and giving or gifting out of abundance and not just giving, right? Because that reinforces this kind of transactional worldview, this transactional relationship. And so really redefining what our relationships are to each other and that there is reciprocity amongst that. So I know I have a lot more to say, but I'm going to hand it back to you, Janine, to kind of close us with some of the maybe the last question of the day.
Yes. I moderate and facilitate a lot, and this is one of the most difficult events I ever have to facilitate because there's so much richness, there's so much importance in everything that you all are saying. You're stimulating so many thoughts through the chats and through the Q&A, and we could spend all day talking about even just one aspect of these topics you all covered so graciously and compassionately and lovingly. But I think one of the things that's top of mind for everyone is looking forward and thinking about the future of philanthropy. Based on your personal lived experience and your wealth of expertise in this field, what are some recommendations you would like to share with those who are working to decolonize, indigenize, and are transformed their work in and outside of philanthropy? We have representatives from NGOs, we have Indigenous peoples and nations that have joined us in this chat. So really holding that whole breath, what are your recommendations for the future? And we will start off this section with Lourdes.
Thank you, Janine. Various ideas come to mind, but I would say that for those of you who are interested on sort of doing a lot of more of a learning journey on getting closer to understanding how do you support, how are you good allies to Indigenous peoples, but also how do you start kind of doing that hard work of decolonizing your institution. I invite you to reach out to Native Americans in Philanthropy if the work applies to the US, to the Circle on and on philanthropy and Aboriginal peoples in Canada. If your work applies to Canada, there's also the Arctic Funders Collaborative, and of course, International Funders for Indigenous Peoples. I think among all of our organizations, these networks are doing the work of really shifting and rethinking how philanthropy should adapt their practices so that, as we say at IFEP, we continue to expand the practice of Indigenous philanthropy, which are based on Indigenous values. And we refer them to that as the 4 R's of Indigenous philanthropy, which are based on respect, relationship, reciprocity, and responsibility. I think also, as you have heard from this panel, you have incredible leadership and what's now, and something that IFEP is also partnering with and working with is the sort of growing cohort. I don't want to say cohort growing because they have existed for many years, but we are now kind of coming together to do more collectively and organize. And I'm referring to Indigenous-led funds or Indigenous funds because they know how the giving and the receiving should be happening within those communities, and there are many different Indigenous-led funds out there. And to that point, IFEP is getting ready to release the first ever report on Indigenous-led funds landscape scan report. And we'll be happy to share it and disseminate it and ask Cultural Survival to share with this audience as well when we have it out. So that you learn more about what does it mean to be an Indigenous-led fund, how is it different from traditional institutional philanthropy. For nonprofits or NGOs, rather, I would say, yes, it is important to partner with the Indigenous leaders and communities, but I sometimes also would love to see NGOs when appropriate and to also step aside and let the Indigenous organization be the ones that are kind of having those direct conversations. Understanding, I think, also what is, as an NGO, it's the role on sharing or not sharing information, which is even another sort of huge topic on sort of data sovereignty and appropriation of knowledge or information from Indigenous communities. I think there's things there that I think maybe for another webinar. And I think for those of us as individuals that are working in this sector, seek out your peers and have those conversations and kind of think about, how together you can really kind of bring a different view within your institutions to welcome different perspectives within your institutions, because I think just by the simple act of start doing that, it can open doors. And yeah, so I'll just stop there. I mean, there's many other ways, but those are some of the things that come to mind.
Thank you, Lourdes. Next, we will have Gabby.
So for the future, what I would recommend, first being transfer of wealth and assets over to Indigenous-led organizations as being one way. And then again, short of that rematriation of wealth, I think there's some other priorities that you can set today over the next year, and some milestones over the next 60, 90-day periods of seating Indigenous people on your board, and more than one. Move beyond just the tokenization or pigeonholing of Indigenous people within your staff, within your senior leadership. I think funding, investing significantly and broadly beyond program support, capital support, Gen Op support, multi-year support, and beyond intermediary support as well, directly to Indigenous communities, tribes, nations, and Indigenous-led organizations. I think the organizational culture, assessing oneself, can be a priority as well. What does your organizational culture look like? Do you move beyond just principles and values into true operationalization of equity and justice? Because that's very different. You can have a value of that, but that does not mean it is operationalized, and that needs to be demonstrated within your organizational culture. So different ways of communicating and recognition of that, communication strategies, decentralized decision-making, all of that can be part of your organizational culture. So you can set these priorities over the next year. And that is just one way of continuing this journey of indigenizing philanthropy. I'll share that much. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. Daisy?
I'm afraid we don't have enough time for me to go about all my recommendations. So again, I bring you back to the series itself, where we offer numerous recommendations. And just to point out, we will have another in our final article of this series coming out within the next week on Indigenous decision-making and Indigenous-led funds as a tool to transform philanthropy. And so for my recommendations, I really want to focus on one really important one. And I think as we talk about transforming philanthropy, we have to also talk about transforming our relationships. Though it's necessary. We cannot transform the field unless we transform the way that we work with each other, and especially our partners on the ground. And so I just want to really outline that some examples that have caused harm between communities and people on the ground and foundations is just really the unwritten rules and protocol that exists in a relationship between a grantee and a funder, and how that's really defined actually pre-contact, right? It's written on the website of a foundation and really outlining the way that they work in this oftentimes very siloed effect, right? And so the terms of engagement are defined pre-contact. And so grantees and partners really have to align their work, sometimes uncomfortably and forcefully, within the funder's kind of approach to the work. And so that is harmful, right? When we have these kind of siloed approaches, that there is maybe unintentional harm that comes with that kind of language, right? And so, but I think what folks really in institutional philanthropy really need to understand is that reciprocity is important, right? And that even as a foundation sets out to have a mission, you are seeking ways through partnerships, through grants, through whatever kind of support that you offer to meet your mission, right? And that you cannot meet your mission without the strategy that you put in place, right? Making a grant to a community. And that foundations really need to understand that, right? That you can't do this work without your communities, and being very mindful of the power imbalance that exists in those relationships. And how these unreasonable expectations sometimes that foundations have actually violate self-determination, actually violates our rights, and actually violates our choices to do the work in which we want to do them, in which we are experts in doing so. And I just really want to put this here, that philanthropy needs to remember that not just the field, not just this work, but life as a whole is all about relationships, right? We're all related, especially in this web of life. And we need to remember that even in the context of philanthropy, again, foundations can't do this work and fulfill their mission without their partners on the ground. So just being always mindful of this interdependence, right, that exists in the relationships, and really moving towards relationships in a way where true trust is built, genuine authenticity and trust is built. And so how do we move from a place of I and operating at an individual level to we, and not even just we as the partner and the program officer or the foundation and the fund, but as a collective, right? Those who are not even in that direct relationship itself, right? And so in doing so, really understanding that the work itself really exhibits a mutual learning journey more than anything. And so, and working singularly, working just in that individualistic manner is actually very colonial itself, right? And it reinforces actually colonization in the field. And so we have to, at an individual level, at a collective level, step back and remember that we are part of a collective and that we're embodying that relationship, that kinship, that solidarity in everything that we do, in our conversations, in the way that we make grants, the way that we support each other's work, the way that we elevate and advocate for each other, that we're interdependent. Our relationships are interdependent with each other. So with that, I'll hand that back to you, Janine.
Thank you, Daisy. Now we will hear from Galena.
Thank you. I'm overwhelmed with gratitude and everything that's been said. It's just so rich and inspiring. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. A lot of things have already been mentioned. I just wanted to say that one thing that has been overlooked and kind of falling through the cracks in mainstream philanthropy is support for healing work. Healing and decolonization work itself, actually. And as Indigenous peoples, I think we're collectively are kind of treading through that landscape from victimhood, from being beneficiaries, from being who's someone standing with an extended hand, to being actors, to being decision makers, to being the protagonist of our own story. And that's what healing does. You know, our traditional ceremony. 2 years ago, my mother and I, we spent 5 months preparing for a traditional ceremony in our homeland, in my homeland. It was absolutely worth it. We spent 4 days in ceremony, and that was absolute magic because it really allowed my community to get together after 2 decades of no ceremony. It's fundamental for Indigenous peoples. It's absolutely fundamental. It allows us to unwire and rewire that brain I was talking about. And I think that maybe funders can support that work. I want to provide a quote by Rebecca Adamson, the founder of First Peoples Worldwide and our Keepers of the Earth Fund, who once said, "You see a correlation between ceremony and suicide and drug abuse in our community. A $500 contribution to a ceremony means many lives saved down the road." That's how important it is for us. Yet, healing work is somehow falling through the cracks. I don't really know of any funders who support that work, which is fundamental for us. And that's just my kind of address to the funders who are in this call, who are watching this webcast, that let's think together how we can support the healing work that needs to be done. The 500 years of colonization had a huge impact to many communities, Indigenous communities around the world, and we need to penetrate that level of trauma and come strong on the other end. Secondly, I think that what's important to say, let's think about supporting outside of our boxes of programs, thematic and regional priorities? Can we think about our work holistically? Again, I mentioned that before, food is not separable from my health. My education is not separable from me being an Indigenous woman. It's holistic. Finally, I think I'd like to mention that we need to consider supporting land purchases, and returning land to Indigenous peoples. It might be helpful to understand that land is the ultimate expression of our freedom and control over one's destiny. For Indigenous peoples, land is everything. It's our grocery store, our mother of all mothers, our teacher. Everything is connected to the land. My cosmovision, my understanding of life is connected to my land. We have a deep spiritual connection between the land and its people. I carry the microbiome of the land I live on. So are you. Sorry. So many Indigenous peoples globally are suffering from displacement, dispossession of their lands. Today, I hear people dying every single day just because a mining company is coming to their land, or agricultural company, a large ag company is coming to their land. And it's real. And there is something that happens to the psyche of people when they are either forcefully removed from the land or they leave their land. There's something happens. And I truly believe that was the primary initial trauma that happened to human being that results down the road, it results in and other illnesses such as biodiversity degradation, relationship degradation, other crises, in the current crisis that we're living in, the climate crisis, health crisis. It's always taking me to the land, that there was some disconnect, this rapture that happened between people and their land. And sometimes it rubs people the wrong way. When you ask, can we support the land purchase to this Indigenous community? And people are not open to this. How we can become open to this? That's my question. So I want to hand it off. Thank you.
Thank you, Galena. Victoria.
When I graduated from law school, my first job, my boss said it was an Indigenous man. And I introduced him to someone who came in the office and said, "This is my boss." And after they left, he said, "Don't call me your boss. We're rejecting that structure. You're a professional. I'm a professional. We're colleagues. We work together." That was the first time I ever experienced an indigenization of a space in a world that wasn't made to be Indigenous. And I started changing myself. As I'm working to heal, to get over these colonial patterns of hierarchy and power dynamics that say that certain letters or certain job titles or certain other things put me up here and somebody else down there, I have to get past that. We have to get past that. We have to start developing an Indigenous relationship to each other, that every person we interact with, whether they're applying for a grant, whether they're someone we work with at work, another funder, that we see each other from more of an Indigenous relationship perspective. Out of healing those patterns in ourselves will come the answers, the changes in the processes, the changes in what we need to do. We will indigenize our spaces again. So I thank you all for the ideas you gave me, and that is what I have to offer in closing.
Thank you all. I mean, I hope you can hear it and feel it, the energy, the excitement, the love, the inspiration that you've all shared. A standing ovation for all of you brilliant sisters in bringing your whole self, your genuine and authentic self to this conversation. You took us all on a journey, starting out with your personal journeys and your fields of expertise and the work you're doing now, and really bringing to wholeness and to light the importance and power of the perspectives, the culture, the beliefs, the strength, the resilience you bring from your peoples, from your bloodlines, your matriarchs, your nations, the places that you come from and that you call home, and really set the tone for the rest of this webinar to remind everyone that what's ultimately being done and what the call to action that's ultimately being made is a call for healing, for restoration, for compassionate, loving justice, and for the opportunity to shift institutional cultures and organizational cultures, which, is another term that has come to protect white supremacy, the status quo, and these embedded injustices in these institutions, to shift to something that reminds all of us of the sacredness we hold, the sacred responsibility we have to truly invest and build and co-create a more just, more balanced, and more sustainable world. There are so many beautiful points you all brought up, from the stories you shared of your families and your communities and the lessons that they taught you, that really show that institutional philanthropy may be a beast and another challenge that lies before us in the exercise of our rights. But the spirit of philanthropy, the philosophy and the history behind it is very much our own and very much from Indigenous peoples. And I really hope that of everything that is shared here, that people listen to this over and over again to be able to dive deeper into your recommendations, into your responses, and into your wisdom to inform how we act either as civil society, as people that are part of philanthropic organizations, as NGOs, that we have the power and the responsibility to stay rooted in those sacred values you all brought to this conversation, and that our power can be exercised collectively when we maintain commitment and responsibility in that loving way. I want to thank you again from the bottom of my heart, both for your participation and the wisdom you brought to this, but also for everything you guys carry in in your everyday life and in the work that you do. This has been a blessing and an honor. And we're going to close out this session with a prayer from Galena.
Sorry, bear with me. 1 second, I'm trying to. All right. Дедин гиху бурхат, мунха хухат тангримне, дале ухне, хадин оин ohing халхине бурхат бултанда. Танда углони се ургалжанаб дя. Ажылдымны туғылжы, худмырдымны уракшин ябухты. Ханын юмыны бутежы бәхти. Орыт ғазарта архилгынгой, маңғыз ғазарта архилдынгой. Му ханын хуша сашын ябухты, хэн хуша нашын балыхты. Уты харғида харылдыжы, унхыдын хырылжы, мартхыдын ханылжы бәхти. Сәк. Thank you. That's my traditional prayer from my homeland.
Thank you, Galena. And as we close, if you haven't already, grab the link that we put in there for our Indigenizing Philanthropy series. Agnes, maybe you can add that in there again. You will find the recording of the webinar, as well as our upcoming and our last article on Indigenous decision-making and Indigenous-led funds. I want to thank everyone again today for all of the wisdom and the nourishment that you really brought to this space, to myself, to the panelists, to each other. And that I also want to extend some gratitude to everyone who's been working behind the scenes here at CS, Agnes and Jamie, and our interpreters, and Kat for really making sure that the space happens flawlessly. So thank you all so much. Follow all of our organizations on social media. and stay tuned for what we have next in store. Yawa, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.